My name is Wendell Cross, and on my 62nd birthday, I sat trapped in a hospital wheelchair, silent, watching my own daughter and the man I once loved like a son gut my home laboratory down to the studs. It wasn't just glass beakers and chemical trays they hauled out the door. It was 30 years of my life, 3 decades bent over dying soil until my spine screamed, breathing mold and rot at 3 in the morning, clawing toward a biological fertilizer that could have rewritten agriculture forever. Movers tramped past me, stuffing my entire existence into cardboard boxes, stamped with the name of my son-in-law's company, Greenspire Dynamics. I looked at Vanessa. The daughter I once carried on my shoulders through rows of tomato vines stood in the doorway, arms crossed, wrapped in a coat that cost more than my monthly pension. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She shoved a medical power of attorney into my trembling hands, the one I'd signed the instant I woke from my stroke, my mind still fogged, unable to tell morning from midnight. "Dad," Garrett said, "the lawyers finished the transfer paperwork. The house is already sold too," Vanessa said, flat as a weather report. "We found you a really nice care facility just outside the city." She never once called it a nursing home. Language is a filthy, convenient tool for people with ice water in their veins. I did not scream. I did not sob. The cruelest blows a man ever takes rarely arrive with any sound at all. Before they wheeled me toward the ambulance to be hauled off to a place where old men go to be forgotten, Vanessa dropped something into my lap. A cheap plastic fake plant. "This one doesn't need watering, Dad. It's time you finally rested." When the ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing me in the dark beside that hideous fake plant, I had no idea I was about to begin the most brutal journey of my life. Vanessa and Garrett believed they had ripped my entire future out by the root. They stole my formula, gutted my home, and threw me onto society's scrap heap. But they forgot one savage law of nature. The things buried in darkness and mud are not dying. They are seeds waiting for the moment they claw their way back into the light. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me which city or country you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this hit you the way this one hit me, hit like and subscribe right now so you never miss the next one. 3 months before that ambulance door slammed shut on me, I collapsed on the concrete floor of my own greenhouse at 11 at night. A beaker of nutrient solution shattering beside my skull. 30 brutal years of my life had gone into that greenhouse behind my house in the hills outside Seattle, chasing a biological fertilizer that could tear dead farmland back from the edge of extinction without a single drop of synthetic poison. I was 62, a widower, and I had no one left to prove any of it to but myself. My wife, Marion, had been gone 11 years. And in her absence, the research had quietly swallowed the only conversation I still knew how to have. I talked to my soil samples the way other men talk to their dogs. I told myself that was simply what a scientist does when a house has gone silent. I did not yet understand how dangerous it is to let your whole identity collapse into a single unfinished project, with no one left to notice if you vanish inside it completely. The stroke was mild, the doctor said, almost a mercy compared to what it could have done. My speech slurred for a week. My right hand shook violently when I tried to hold a pen, the same hand that had filled 3 decades of notebooks nobody else had ever read closely. But my mind, they assured my daughter, was intact. I remember lying in that hospital bed, tubes taped to my hand, watching Vanessa sit beside me with a stack of papers and a pen already uncapped, ready before I'd even finished blinking the glare out of my eyes. "It's just so the hospital can talk to Garrett and me if anything happens, Dad." "Standard stuff," she said, and I believed her, because in the haze after a stroke, a man will sign almost anything a loved one places gently in front of him. I signed the medical power of attorney. 2 weeks later, still fogged, still trusting like a fool, I signed what she called a supplementary form for insurance. I did not read it closely. That form handed Garrett Hargrove, my son-in-law, legal authority to seize and manage my intellectual property while I was incapacitated. I want to be brutally honest about something. I loved Garrett once, fiercely. He came into our family 9 years ago, dazzling and ravenous, a venture capitalist with a savage talent for making people believe in things that didn't exist yet, a man who could sell an empty room to the person who already owned the building. I mistook his hunger for character. I told myself a man who wanted so badly to build something would understand exactly what 30 years of building something actually costs a human body. I was catastrophically wrong in ways that still rip me out of sleep some nights, replaying every dinner where I let him refill my glass and call me family with that same predatory smile. For 3 months I lay in that hospital, then a rehab center, relearning how to hold a spoon, how to sign my own name in something other than a shaking scroll. Vanessa visited twice a week, rushed, glued to her phone under the table. Garrett visited, never always sending apologies through her. A deal in Portland, a pitch meeting in San Francisco that couldn't wait for a dying old man's recovery. I did not think much of it then. I was too busy relearning to walk a straight line, too pathetically grateful for what I still believed was my family's devotion, to notice the moving trucks already tearing my own house apart 3 miles away, while I lay in a bed with railings, utterly unaware. The day I was discharged, I expected to go home. I had pictured it for 3 months straight, the smell of wet soil, the slant of afternoon light through the cracked panes, the notebook left open with the last unfinished notation of my life's work. Instead, an orderly wheeled me out to a car I didn't recognize, driven by a man I didn't recognize, and I was dumped not at my house but at a low beige building on the edge of the city, Willowbrook Senior Residence, in a cheerful, mocking font that turned my stomach before I understood why. Vanessa and Garrett were waiting inside with a lawyer I'd never met, a thin man in a gray suit clutching a leather folder like a shield. That was where I learned, in a conference room the size of a closet, everything they had savagely done while I couldn't lift a pen. My house had been sold. My greenhouse demolished to the foundation, not one brick left standing. And worse, Garrett had used the authority I'd signed away in my fog to file a patent on 30 years of my agricultural research, seizing the entire body of work under the name of his company, Greenspire Dynamics, as though he had built a single day of it himself, as though 30 years of my sweat and my grief belonged to him by right. "It was the smart move, Wendell," Garrett said, not even glancing up from his phone. "The research needed a business structure behind it. You were never going to commercialize it lying half dead in a hospital bed, and every month it sat unfiled, we were bleeding real value into the ground." I did not raise my voice. I sat rigid and silent in that wheelchair and asked my daughter one question instead. What had they done with her dead mother's things? The ceramic pots Marion had painted by hand, her gardening journals, soft from years of use, the wind chime that used to wake me gently at dawn, the year before she died. Vanessa didn't answer directly. As the orderly wheeled me toward my new prison, she shoved something small and plastic into my lap, cold against my palms. "This one will never die, Dad," she said, tucking a folded note under the pot without meeting my eyes. "Just like you don't have to work so hard anymore. It's time to rest. We'll cover the costs here. Don't worry your head about that part." I didn't open the note until I was alone in that room under humming fluorescent light, surrounded by furniture that belonged to no one and everyone at once. It said exactly what she'd said aloud, scrawled in her own hurried, slanted hand, as though she'd written it in the elevator rather than let herself think about it for a second longer than 30. I held that plastic plant for what felt like hours. I did not cry, though something moved violently through my chest that was worse than crying, with no release valve at all, nowhere to put it down. And then, inside that suffocating stillness, my mind, the same mind that had spent 30 years learning to notice what other scientists missed entirely, cracked a single, savage sliver of light into the room. The formula Garrett had patented, now legally the property of Greenspire Dynamics, was not the finished work. It was an early, abandoned draft, discarded 4 years earlier, missing the one component that made the real formula function at all, a biological catalyst I had never once written down anywhere except inside my own skull. They had not stolen my life's work. They had stolen a hollow shell of it, and in their greed and their hurry, they didn't even know the difference between the two. That night, I ripped the monitoring bracelet off my wrist with fingers that barely obeyed me. I found the old coat I'd worn into the hospital, still hanging untouched, threadbare at both elbows. I tore open the false lining of a battered travel case that had once been Marion's, the one I'd kept only because it had been hers, and I shoved my core research notebook inside it, the only copy of the real formula, the one they didn't even know they were missing. Then I walked out through a side door the night staff had carelessly left propped for a smoke break, and I did not look back at Willowbrook Senior Residence once, not for a single second. I did not know where I was going. I only knew that soil could die. Chemicals could poison a field until nothing grew there for a generation, but a father's will was not something you could ever file a patent on. I made myself a vicious, unbreakable promise in the dark of that parking lot, with nothing but a stolen suitcase, a threadbare coat, and a single night's head start before anyone noticed I was gone. I would show them exactly what they had thrown away like trash, exactly what they had assumed was already dead and worthless and finished. Land could die. I fully intended not to. I do not remember every bus I dragged myself onto out of Seattle. I remember the money running out somewhere in the third week, the last of my savings drained down to $11.40 in a filthy bus station bathroom in a town whose name I never bothered to learn, because I never planned on staying there a single hour longer than necessary. I remember riding as far east and south as that $11 would carry me, then walking the rest of the way in a threadbare coat, with a stolen suitcase, and a notebook worth more than any bank account I had ever owned, though at that brutal moment it could not buy me a sandwich or a bus ticket to anywhere warmer. I ended up in a town in West Texas that was dying by violent inches. Years of drought had cracked the earth into a pattern like shattered pottery, and decades of over-fertilization before that had poisoned what little moisture remained, so that even the weeds along the roadside struggled and failed to hold on. Half the storefronts on the main street stood boarded and abandoned, the ones that weren't sold little more than gasoline and fried food. The town's one truck stop sat on the highway like a life raft, and it was there, at 62, with a stroke still healing violently somewhere in the wiring of my brain, that I begged a stranger behind the register for any work at all, for any price at all, in exchange for a place to sleep that wasn't a ditch. The man behind the register, a cook named Dale, who never once asked where I'd come from, told me flatly he couldn't pay me in anything but food and a place out back. And I told him that would be more than I had that morning. I spent that first month scraping trash off the parking lot and scrubbing dishes in a kitchen that reeked permanently of burnt grease, in exchange for a filthy cot in a storage shed and whatever the cook didn't want off the grill at closing. My hands, which had once handled delicate laboratory instruments with surgical precision, cracked and bled raw from dishwater and industrial lye soap. I told no one who I had been. I did not have the strength left to explain it, and I suspected correctly that no one there would have believed a filthy old drifter had once run a private research laboratory worth more than the entire town put together. The man who owned the barn where I eventually found real shelter was named Gus Renner, 70 years old, built like a fence post, with the kind of squint that comes from 60 brutal years of Texas sun and not 1 ounce of patience for foolishness. He caught me the first week sleeping in his hay barn on a bed of old feed sacks, and he came at me with a shotgun cracked open over his forearm, not aimed at me exactly, but close enough that the message hit like a slap across the face. "I don't run a charity for drifters," Gus barked. "Get your things and get off my land before I stop being polite about it, old man." I did not argue with him. I had learned by then that a man in my position does not win arguments with a landowner holding a shotgun, no matter how many worthless degrees hang on a wall 3 states away. But as I gathered my few things, I noticed the tree at the edge of his property, an old live oak, easily 100 years old by the girth of its trunk, half its canopy already gone brown and brittle, dying from root rot and chemical runoff drifting over from a neighboring field long since gone fallow and abandoned. Before I left, I asked him if I could try something with that tree. I told him it would cost him nothing but a week of his patience, and that if it failed, he would never see my face again. Gus laughed at me, harshly, the way a man laughs at something so absurd it briefly interrupts his own boiling anger. But he let me stay one more night, muttering something bitter about crazy old fools and their dying trees. That night, and every night after it for a week, I worked by lantern light, mixing what scraps I could scavenge, coffee grounds from the truck stop, eggshells and vegetable trimmings from the diner, wild weeds ripped from the ditch, all of it layered the exact brutal way I had spent 30 years learning to layer it, coaxing the right bacterial cultures to bloom in the right sequence, at the right temperature, in the right proportion of moisture to waste. I poured what I made around the base of that dying oak each evening and told Gus, honestly, that I could not promise him a single thing. 9 days later, new leaf buds tore through bark that Gus had already written off as dead wood 2 seasons earlier. He stood under that tree for a long time without saying anything, running his thumb over a branch that 1 week before had snapped dry in his hand like kindling. "How?" he finally said. Not really a question, more like a man testing whether the air around him had violently changed shape without his permission. I told him the truth, or as much of it as I could bear to say aloud yet, that I had spent 30 years studying how to tear dead soil back to life, that I had lost everything to people I had trusted with my whole heart, and that this tree was the first living thing I had been allowed to touch with my own hands in months. Gus looked at me for a long moment, the way a man sizes up a horse he is deciding whether to bet on, then pointed toward the worst, most barren corner of his property. 4 acres of cracked, salt-poisoned earth that had grown nothing since before his own father died and left him the land. "You can have that patch," he said. "Nobody wants it anyway. Hasn't grown a weed in 15 years. You fix that, I'll believe whatever story you're telling me. You don't. I still won't call the sheriff on an old man for wasting his own time out here." I did not have a laboratory anymore. I did not have precision instruments, climate-controlled rooms, or assistants running samples at 2 in the morning while I slept. I had 4 acres of ruined dirt, a handful of rusted 55-gallon drums Gus let me drag out of his equipment shed, and the notebook I had smuggled out of a nursing home in a dead woman's suitcase lining. I fermented compost in those rusted drums the way other men might tend to still checking pH levels with paper strips bought $1 at a time from the feed store, turning the mixture by hand because I had no machine left to do it for me anymore. The work nearly broke what remained of my body. I was 62 years old, recovering from a stroke, hauling water in buckets across 4 acres under a Texas sun that did not care in the slightest how exhausted an old man was. My back seized up more nights than it didn't. My hands, already cracked from dishwater, split further from raw compost and rusted metal until Gus started leaving a tin of salve outside the barn door without ever mentioning it, the way certain hard men only show kindness when they can pretend they aren't doing it at all. I did not sleep much that year. I thought more often than I want to admit, even now, about simply lying down in that cracked dirt and letting it finish what the stroke had started months earlier. But every time that thought clawed its way in, I thought of the plastic plant sitting on a shelf back in Willowbrook, the one that would never die because it had never truly been alive in the first place. And something feral in me refused to become that hollow thing. I would rather die trying to grow something real than survive as something fake, propped up in a corner for other people's convenience, admired by no one, and needed by nothing. So I kept working, 1 bucket, 1 drum, 1 square foot of poisoned earth at a time, and slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, the ground beneath my hands began, impossibly, violently, to change. By the end of that first brutal year, the 4 acres Gus had thrown at me out of pity had become something neither of us fully knew how to explain to the neighbors. Where the ground had been cracked and white with salt the previous spring, it now exploded with rows of sorghum and cotton, so dense and violently green that truckers on the highway slammed their brakes just to gawk through their windshields. The yield came in at nearly triple what the county extension office considered a good season for that soil type, and it had been grown without a single drop of synthetic pesticide. The insects that should have devoured a monoculture that size simply didn't dare. The plants themselves, fed from the roots up on a living microbial network instead of a chemical drip, had grown savagely strong enough to fight their own battles without help from a can or a sprayer. Word travels strangely, almost violently in a small farming town. It doesn't move through newspapers. It moves through church parking lots after Sunday service, through the counter at the feed store, through men leaning against their trucks, comparing notes on a season that had otherwise gutted almost everyone else in the county that year. Within 2 months, I had a line of skeptical, sunburned men showing up at the edge of Gus's property, arms crossed, boots planted, like they were bracing for a fight, demanding to see the field for themselves before they'd believe a word about a stranger's dirt. These were not men inclined to trust an outsider, certainly not one who had wandered into their town with nothing but a stolen suitcase and a limp from a stroke he never fully explained. Texas farmers, in my experience, guard their pride the way other men guard a loaded weapon, close to the body, rarely displayed, but never far from reach. It cost some of them real bitter dignity to walk onto that field, kick at the dirt, and admit out loud that whatever this drifter was doing worked better than 3 generations of their own family's methods had ever managed. A few stormed off without a word, too proud to admit what their own eyes had just shown them, and came crawling back a week later anyway, hat in hand, asking quietly if the offer still stood. I did not sell them the formula. I want to be brutally honest about why, because it would have made me wealthy far faster than anything else I could have done. I had already watched up close and gutted from the inside exactly what happens when a formula like mine gets treated as a product to be owned and hoarded behind a patent wall. I had lived the vicious consequences of that greed inside my own family, and I was not interested in building a second Greenspire Dynamics out of spite, no matter how satisfying the money might have felt for a season or 2. So instead, I gathered those farmers in Gus's equipment shed on a Tuesday evening under a bare bulb with moths circling it violently, and I taught them for free exactly how to build what I had built. The ratios, the timing, the merciless patience it demanded, the way a compost pile could be read like a living thing if you paid attention to its temperature, its smell, the color of the steam tearing off it in the cold morning air. We called it the Iron Roots Cooperative, a name Gus spat out half as a joke, describing how stubborn and impossible to kill the whole operation had turned out to be, much like the man behind it. It stuck immediately, like a burr in denim. Within a year, Iron Roots had exploded from 4 acres into a working network spanning 9 counties, sharing compost techniques, seed stock, and hard-won knowledge about which combinations worked on which kind of ruined ground. I did not charge dues. I demanded only that every farmer who joined commit to teaching 2 others, the same way Gus had once shoved 4 worthless acres and a shotgun-backed ultimatum into my hands, expecting nothing back but results and brutal honesty. I remember a widow named Beatrice, 3 farms down. On the violent verge of losing land her husband's family had worked for 4 generations, poisoned nearly to death by decades of bad advice from fertilizer salesmen who never had to live with the consequences. She joined the cooperative the same month her bank sent its final warning letter, arriving with nothing but a borrowed truck and a face set hard against the possibility of hoping for anything again. 14 months later, she stood in a field of thriving cotton and wept openly, telling me afterward, embarrassed, that she hadn't cried since her husband's funeral. Stories like hers repeated themselves quietly and relentlessly, farm by farm, across those 9 counties, and it was those stories, not any advertisement, that carried our name from one kitchen table to the next. I never once tried to hide what we were doing. I simply chose, very deliberately, to hide who I was while we did it. Gus became the public face of Iron Roots, his name on the paperwork, his weathered face in the one local newspaper article that eventually ran on us, his voice answering the phone when calls started flooding in from outside the county. I remained, on every official document, nothing more than a consultant. I had already spent my entire previous life building a name in Seattle, a name that had ultimately meant nothing to the people who were supposed to love me most. Out here, I preferred being no one in particular. I preferred letting the work scream for itself, louder than any signature ever could. The work did scream. Within 18 months, agricultural buyers from as far as Kansas and Nebraska were driving down to see the fields with their own eyes, unable to believe the yield numbers a cooperative had posted from land declared agriculturally dead only a few years earlier. A handful of clean food conglomerates began fighting for supply contracts directly with us, drawn by both the yield and the story, though they never learned the full brutal story, only the sanitized version. Gus handed them over coffee in his own kitchen. I remember the day the first 6-figure contract came through, signed not by me but by Gus, shaking his head violently at the number like it belonged to some other man's life entirely. I was out in the field when he found me, still wearing the same overalls I'd worn nearly every day for 2 years, my hands buried wrist-deep in a fresh batch of compost, checking its temperature with the back of my hand, the way I drilled into every farmer in the cooperative. "You could be a rich man, you know," Gus said, holding the contract out like it might scald him. "Your name could be on this instead of mine. Nobody out here would blame you for wanting the credit you're owed after everything." I told him I had already been a man with my name on things once, and it had not protected me from a single thing that mattered in the end. I told him I would rather be the man in the field with dirt permanently ground under his fingernails, unnamed and unbothered, than ever again be the kind of man whose entire life's worth could be signed away on a single piece of paper while he lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Gus didn't argue. He simply nodded and went back inside to file the paperwork under his own name, the way he always did without a shred of complaint. By the time 3 brutal years had passed since I walked out of Willowbrook Senior Residence with nothing but a stolen suitcase, Iron Roots had become something the agricultural press in 3 states had started writing about. A cooperative worth, by conservative estimate, well into 8 figures, feeding contracts to companies whose products sat on grocery shelves across the entire country. And through all of it, I remained exactly what I had chosen to become, an old man in worn overalls checking soil temperature by hand at dawn, letting a stubborn 70-year-old farmer take every ounce of the credit while I, quietly, savagely built, from nothing but ruined dirt and a stolen head start, something no one could ever again rip from me with a single signature on a hospital form. While I was learning to read compost the way other men read scripture, life back in Seattle had gone on savagely without me, and I would not learn the brutal details until much later, pieced together from court filings and a conversation I never expected to have. But I have replayed it enough times since that I can tell it now almost as though I had been standing in the room myself. Greenspire Dynamics launched its flagship fertilizer, branded shamelessly under my stolen research, 18 months after I vanished from Willowbrook. Garrett had rushed it to market recklessly ahead of schedule, desperate to prove to his investors that seizing an incapacitated old scientist's intellectual property had been the shrewd, decisive move he'd promised them it would be. The marketing was slick and hollow, screaming words like revolutionary and biologically superior, ripped almost verbatim from grant proposals I had written a decade earlier. What the product did not have, what it could never have had, was the one component that made the real formula function, the specific biological catalyst that existed nowhere on paper, in no file Garrett's lawyers had seized. It existed only in the one part of my mind that no power of attorney could ever violate. The flaw did not surface immediately. It surfaced 3 brutal growing seasons in, on farms that had paid premium prices for a product promising to resurrect their soil. Instead, Greenspire's fertilizer triggered a violent chemical imbalance that, under the wrong conditions, scorched root systems from the inside out. Entire orchards in California died gradually, and then all at once, in the span of a single catastrophic August. A vineyard in Oregon lost 2 full seasons, and very nearly its entire hillside of 40-year-old vines. The lawsuits arrived before any apology ever did, and by the time Greenspire issued a public statement, it read less like contrition and more like a company frantically counting down the hours until its own collapse. I heard some of this secondhand, through farmers in the cooperative, who read agricultural trade publications and mentioned, almost as an aside over coffee in Gus's kitchen, that some flashy Seattle biotech company was getting sued into the ground over a fertilizer that killed root systems instead of resurrecting them. I remember the strange, quiet feeling that tore through me that night. Not triumph, not exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't something feral in me that recognized the shape of justice arriving on its own vicious schedule, without my having to lift a single finger to summon it. By the time Greenspire's second year of litigation began, Garrett and Vanessa were, by every account I later pieced together, staring down the real possibility of prison. Several of the original investors, the same men who had once toasted Garrett's ambition at galas I'd occasionally been dragged to before my stroke, were now savaging him with accusations of securities fraud, alleging he had grossly misrepresented the maturity and true ownership of the research to raise capital under blatantly false pretenses. Vanessa, who had signed several of the early investor documents alongside her husband, in the arrogant years before any of this began, found her own name attached to the same filings, the same subpoenas, the same devastating accusations. Their house, the very house they had funded, in part by selling mine out from under me, went up for a hurried, humiliating private sale that spring. I understand the 2 of them turned savagely on each other, each blaming the other for a decision they had made together with equal greed. I understand there was a particular night, roughly 8 months before Garrett's flight to Texas, when the 2 of them sat across from each other at the kitchen island, drowning in numbers with a forensic accountant their lawyer had hired to brace for the coming depositions. Vanessa apparently asked Garrett, for the first time in their marriage, whether any of it, the power of attorney, the rushed patent filing, the nursing home paperwork signed while I was still recovering, had ever felt wrong to him in the moment. He told her, according to what I later heard secondhand, that it had felt like business, and that business decisions were never supposed to feel like anything at all. She did not have a response to that cruelty. She simply sat with it, staring at numbers that represented the violent unraveling of everything they had built on a foundation that was never truly theirs. It was around this time that the name Iron Roots began appearing in the same agricultural press that had once fawned over Greenspire's meteoric rise, though now the coverage ran in the opposite, brutal direction. Headlines marveling at a cooperative achieving yields and soil recovery numbers that made Greenspire's failed patented product look like exactly what it was, an unfinished draft, sold to the public as a miracle it had never earned the right to call itself. I know that within weeks, Garrett had booked a flight to a regional airport an hour from Gus's farm, carrying with him what remained of his liquidity and a version of raw desperation he had never once had to feel in his entire privileged life before that year. His plan, as it was later described to me, was simple and almost pitiably transparent. Buy the licensing rights to whatever Iron Roots had built, fold it quietly into Greenspire's collapsing structure, and use it as evidence to investors and courts alike that the company's underlying science had finally been validated. He did not know, could not have known, whose cooperative he was flying toward. Gus's name was the only one that had ever appeared publicly attached to Iron Roots. As far as Garrett understood, he was simply flying to Texas to make one last desperate deal with a stranger who might save him from ruin. He did not know his own son had followed him onto that same flight. Caleb was 14 that year, and he had spent most of the previous 18 months watching his parents' marriage tear itself apart in a house that had grown colder with every passing month, full of hushed, vicious phone calls behind closed doors and the particular tension of two adults blaming each other without ever saying so directly in front of him. He had been assigned that spring a school research project on innovation in American agriculture, and it was there, scrolling obsessively through article after article about a mysterious cooperative in West Texas that had torn back years of drought damage on soil everyone else had abandoned, that something in him quietly caught fire. He wrote his essay on what the articles were calling the Texas Miracle, and in doing so he found himself thinking, for the first time in years, about the summers he used to spend in his grandfather's greenhouse before the stroke, before the lawyers, before his mother scrubbed my name entirely out of their house. Caleb had never been told directly that I had vanished under suspicious circumstances. He had absorbed, the way children absorb things adults think they're hiding well, that something rotten had happened involving his grandfather, his mother, and a great deal of money, and that the subject was not to be raised at the dinner table. But he remembered me. He remembered a summer spent crouched beside me in the greenhouse, learning to identify root rot by smell, being told that dirt was not dirty, that it was the most honest material on earth because it never lied about what had been done to it. When he overheard his father on the phone that week, arranging a private flight to a small airport in Texas to meet with the operators of a farming cooperative called Iron Roots, something in a 14-year-old's chest recognized the coincidence for exactly what it might actually be. He packed a single bag, told his mother he was staying at a friend's house for the weekend, and used cash he'd been quietly hoarding from birthdays and odd jobs to book a seat on a commercial flight, landing near the same regional airport his father's charter was headed toward. He did not fully understand yet what he was walking into. He only knew, with a fierce and unshakable clarity, that somewhere in Texas, in a cooperative that farmers were calling a miracle, there might be a piece of the grandfather he had lost, and that he was done waiting for either of his parents to hand him a single word of the truth. I did not learn until later that Vanessa had booked her own flight to Texas that same week, separately from Garrett, after a phone call between them that apparently exploded into shouting loud enough that a neighbor complained. She told him, according to what I eventually pieced together from Gus, who overheard more than either of them realized, that she was not going to let him walk into a negotiation that could save or bury both of their futures without her standing beside him. I suspect the raw truth was closer to fear than loyalty. Fear of what a deal made without her might mean for her own legal exposure. Fear of being cut out of whatever last desperate card her husband thought he still had left to play. Whatever the reason, the two of them arrived at the Iron Roots office within an hour of each other, both looking gutted, hollow-eyed from a flight neither of them had slept through, and Gus, following instructions I had given him weeks earlier, escorted them together into the cooperative's meeting room. The room itself was nothing like the glass-walled conference suites Garrett was accustomed to. It was a converted section of Gus's old equipment barn, insulated and dry-walled, but still reeking faintly of machine oil and hay, with a long table hammered from reclaimed barnwood and a single ceiling fan grinding lazily overhead, stirring dust in the slanted afternoon light. I'd insisted on that particular room over Gus's suggestion that we meet somewhere more official in town. I wanted them to feel, in their bodies before they understood it in their minds, that everything I had built here had been carved from nothing their money could ever have touched. Garrett walked in first in a suit clearly tailored for boardrooms in a different, more forgiving city, clutching a leather folder, not unlike the one that lawyer had carried into my discharge meeting years earlier. He had rehearsed his opening, I could tell the instant he started speaking, a smooth pitch about synergy and vertical integration and mutual opportunity, the exact kind of hollow language men use when they are desperate to disguise the stink of their own ruin. Vanessa sat beside him, dressed more simply than I remembered her composure cracking beneath the same designer coat she'd worn the day she handed me a plastic plant and called it kindness. Neither of them noticed at first the tall leather chair at the head of the table, turned away facing the small window that looked out over the 4 acres where this entire war had begun. Gus took a seat at the far end, arms crossed, saying nothing, letting Garrett hammer through his pitch to what looked, from where they sat, like an empty room for nearly 2 full minutes before I finally turned that chair around. I wish I could describe adequately what tore across both of their faces in that moment. It was the look of 2 people watching a solid floor rip itself out from under them, mid-sentence, revealing itself to have been an illusion the entire time. Garrett's mouth hung open for a full 3 seconds without producing a single word. Vanessa went the color of old paper, both hands flying to her chest as though she needed to physically hold something inside her body from spilling out. "Dad," Vanessa finally gasped, her voice cracking violently in a way that might have moved me once, before I understood exactly how easily her voice could manufacture whatever emotion the moment demanded of it. "Dad, we didn't know you were—" "You didn't know I was alive," I said, my voice flat and cold as steel. "I understand. It's a reasonable assumption given that you left me rotting on the floor of your own conscience the day you handed me a plastic plant and told me it was time to rest." Garrett recovered faster than his wife, the way men like him always do, lunging immediately for the language of negotiation because it was the only language he had ever fully trusted to save him from anything. He began babbling about pressure from the board, about investors who had shoved him into moving faster than he should have, about how none of it had ever been personal, Wendell. It had only ever been business, and how he hoped that now, given everything, we could carve out some kind of path forward that worked for everyone at this table. I let him talk himself hoarse. I have found that letting a dishonest man talk himself into a corner does far more brutal damage to him than any interruption of mine ever could. "You flew here," I said once he had finally exhausted his momentum in his own borrowed vocabulary, "to buy the rights to something you assume I built for money. You still don't understand what you actually stole from me, do you? It was never the formula. Any formula can be rebuilt, given enough time and enough desperation, which I clearly had both of, in savage surplus. What you actually ripped from me was 30 years I no longer have to give to something new. Years I will never claw back at my age. That is not for sale. Not to you, not at any number your investors could scrape together before your court date arrives." Vanessa tried again, softer this time, reaching across the table toward me with a hand I refused to take. She said she was sorry, that she had made a catastrophic mistake, that she thought about the plastic plant more often than I could possibly imagine, that not a single week went by without her choking on regret over the note she'd left folded beneath it. I believed and still believe today that some fragment of what she said was true. I do not believe it was the whole truth, and I do not believe it would have ever clawed its way out of her mouth at all if Greenspire's balance sheet had still been healthy that year. I did not raise my voice. I reached instead beneath the barnwood table, where I had placed a plain cardboard box that morning before either of them arrived, and I shoved it across the table until it slammed to a stop directly in front of the two of them. Garrett opened it first, his hands shaking in a way I had never once witnessed in him before, not even during the family's most vicious arguments over the years. Inside sat the same cheap plastic plant Vanessa had pressed into my lap outside Willowbrook Senior Residence, along with the original note, still folded exactly as she had folded it, its ink slightly faded, but perfectly, brutally legible after all this time. "Your product killed root systems because it had no roots of its own," I said. "It was built on theft instead of understanding, and theft cannot sustain anything for very long, no matter how good the packaging looks. This plant, on the other hand, will never die, because it was never alive to begin with. That was the entire point of your gift to me, wasn't it? Take it home. Sell it if you need the money that badly by now. It's the only asset either of you has left that I'm still willing to let you keep." Vanessa broke down sobbing, and I still cannot tell to this day whether the tears were genuine or simply the last tool she had left in a room where every other tool had already failed her completely. Garrett said nothing further. He snapped the box shut, stood, and stormed out of the barn without another word, the leather folder still tucked uselessly under his arm, its rehearsed pitch never once delivered past the first 2 minutes. I did not walk them out. Gus did that silently and returned a few minutes later to tell me their rental car had torn away from the property faster than any car reasonably needed to on a gravel road that rutted and shook with every mile. I sat alone at that barnwood table for a long while afterward, the ceiling fan grinding slowly overhead, feeling something I had not expected to feel in that moment at all. Not triumph, not even relief exactly. Something closer to the quiet, exhausted stillness of a man who has finally set down a weight he had carried so violently long he'd forgotten what his own shoulders felt like without it crushing into them. I did not see him standing there until Gus came back in a second time, quieter than before, and told me there was a boy at the barn door who wouldn't say who he belonged to. I remember the violent stillness that seized me in that instant, a feeling I can only compare to the moment 9 days into treating that dying oak tree, when I first spotted a single bud tearing through where there should have been nothing but brittle, dead bark. Caleb was standing just outside the doorway, backpack still slung over one shoulder, looking somehow both older and smaller than the last time I had seen him 4 years earlier, in a house that no longer belonged to any of us. He had shot up nearly a foot. His face had lost most of the softness I remembered from his childhood, replaced by the wary, hollowed-out expression of a boy who has spent too many years pressed against closed doors, straining to piece together a truth no one in his life would ever hand him directly. For a moment neither of us moved a muscle. Then he said my name, just once, quietly, as though testing whether it was actually safe to say it out loud in that particular barn, so violently far from everything he'd been raised inside of. I do not have adequate words for what tore through my chest in the seconds after that. I have spent the better part of this account describing a man capable of extraordinary, unflinching coldness toward the two people who betrayed him most completely in his life, and I stand by every ounce of that coldness, even now, without a shred of regret. But I want to be honest about something that shocked even me in that moment. Whatever hardness I had forged over 4 brutal years of rebuilding my life from cracked Texas dirt shattered instantly, without any resistance at all, the moment that boy crossed the threshold and threw his arms around me. He told me everything in fragments over the following hour, sitting together on an overturned crate outside the barn while Gus discreetly made himself scarce. He told me about the essay he'd written for school, about the articles on the Texas Miracle he'd devoured late into the night, about the cold, brittle house he'd grown up in over the past 4 years, choked with hushed, vicious arguments and a name, my name, that had become forbidden in his own home. He told me he had followed his father onto a plane because some fierce part of him had simply refused to believe I was gone, the way his parents seemed desperate for him to believe without ever quite saying so outright. He asked me, finally, in a voice that cracked violently in exactly the place a 14-year-old's voice cracks when it is trying very hard not to. Why I had never once tried to reach him directly in all that time. All those years he'd spent gutted with wondering. I told him the truth, because I had decided, standing in that barn, that he had earned nothing less than the brutal whole of it. I told him that in the earliest, most desperate years, I had nothing to offer him. No home, no stability, nothing but a stolen suitcase and a body still recovering violently from a stroke, and that I had refused to drag a child into that kind of chaos, especially a child whose parents I did not trust to interpret any contact from me honestly. I told him that every single year that tore past without a letter or a phone call had cost me something I would never fully claw back, and that I understood completely if some part of him needed time to forgive that silence. He did not need time. He simply pressed his head against my shoulder the way he used to when he was small enough to be carried through the greenhouse on my hip, and for a long while neither of us said anything else at all. The months that followed tore past quickly, in the strange, compressed way that consequences sometimes do once they finally arrive after years of being postponed by money and lawyers. Greenspire Dynamics collapsed into bankruptcy within the year, its remaining assets liquidated brutally to partially satisfy the judgments from the root-rot lawsuits that had never stopped accumulating. Garrett was indicted on securities fraud charges tied to the misrepresentations he had made to early investors, and though his attorneys clawed the sentence down considerably from what prosecutors initially sought, he did not escape prison entirely, spending just over 2 brutal years at a minimum security facility outside Sacramento. Vanessa was not charged criminally, but she lost nearly everything in the civil judgments that followed, along with something I suspect she valued even more by that point, her son's willingness to keep living under her roof at all. Caleb chose, with a fierce clarity I do not think either of his parents ever expected from a 14-year-old, to petition the court himself, with my support, to come live with me permanently in Texas. The custody proceedings were not simple. Vanessa fought them viciously at first, more out of wounded pride than any genuine belief that staying with her would actually serve her son's well-being, and I understood that impulse, even as I opposed it ferociously in court. But Caleb was firm and unshakable in every single interview the court-appointed evaluator conducted with him over those months, and in the end, the judge granted me guardianship, citing both the boy's own clearly and repeatedly stated wishes and the mounting evidence of instability in the home Vanessa had left in ruins. I remember signing the final paperwork with a pen that did not shake at all, in stark contrast to the trembling hand that had signed away my life's work 4 years earlier in a hospital bed under humming fluorescent light. I remember thinking quite fiercely that this, at least, was a piece of paper I trusted completely, because for the first time in a very long time, it recorded a truth rather than concealed one. Caleb arrived at Gus's farm for good with 2 suitcases and considerably less certainty about what a life spent outdoors might actually demand of him physically. I did not ease him into it gently, and I do not apologize for that decision even now. I started him exactly where Gus had started me, on his knees in the dirt, learning to pull weeds without disturbing the root systems of the plants growing beside them, learning to recognize the particular smell of compost that is finished curing from compost that still needs another brutal week of turning, his hands blistered raw in the first month the way mine had blistered years earlier in that same unforgiving soil. He complained some days the way any 14-year-old raised in a house with central air conditioning and a housekeeper would reasonably complain about being ordered to kneel in 90-degree heat pulling invasive grass by hand. But he kept dragging himself back to the field every single morning without being asked twice, and by the end of that first brutal season, he had begun asking questions about soil composition that reminded me, more than I expected them to, of the version of myself who had first fallen violently in love with this work more than 4 decades earlier, long before loss and betrayal had ever torn their way into the picture at all. I made a decision during that first year with Caleb that I want to explain carefully, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this entire account. I did not restructure Iron Roots into a private company and hand him the title of sole heir. I had already watched, up close and gutted, at devastating cost, exactly what an inheritance handed down, as blind entitlement can do to a family. I had lived inside the wreckage of that exact kind of thinking myself, though in my case it had been my life's work rather than land that had been treated as something owed rather than something savagely earned through honest labor. Instead, working with lawyers Gus and I both trusted completely, I converted Iron Roots into a permanent community trust, its governance shared among the farmers of the cooperative, its resources locked by charter into continuing exactly the work it had always done from the very first season, teaching ruined land how to claw its way back to life, freely, for anyone willing to put in the brutal, honest labor it demanded of them. I told Caleb this directly, sitting with him on the same overturned crate where he had first told me his own story months earlier. I told him that he would inherit nothing automatically, that Iron Roots would never simply be handed to him the way Green Spire had once been handed, without a single day of earning it, to a man who had never once dug his own hands into the dirt he claimed to have built an entire empire from. I told him that if he wanted a genuine place in this work, permanent and fully earned, he would need to spend years clawing it up from the ground, quite literally, proving through labor and patience and honest attention exactly the kind of respect for land and for people that his father had never once demonstrated toward either one. He did not argue with me about any of it. He simply nodded, the way a boy nods when he has already, somewhere in the last several months of blisters and brutal early mornings, decided this was the life he actually wanted for himself, rather than the one that had simply been shoved into his hands by an accident of birth. There is a particular evening I return to often now, years later, when I try to summarize what all of this ultimately meant. Caleb was maybe 16 by then, tall enough to look me nearly in the eye, his hands permanently calloused, in a way that would have quietly horrified his mother if she had ever bothered to come out and see them for herself. We were walking the edge of the original 4 acres together at dusk, the same ruined patch of earth Gus had once thrown at me as a punishment disguised as a genuine opportunity, now thick with healthy sorghum swaying violently in the evening wind rolling in off the plains. Caleb asked me, out of nowhere, whether I still had the plastic plant. I told him I did. I kept it quite deliberately on a windowsill in my small house on the property, where I could see it every single morning while drinking my coffee before the sun tore over the fields. Not out of bitterness, though I will admit there was some of that lingering in the earlier years of keeping it there. I kept it because it reminded me, every single day, of a particular kind of brutal truth I had learned the hard way and never wanted to forget again as long as I lived, that the things people try to convince you are already dead, already finished, already worth nothing more than a plastic imitation of themselves, are very often exactly the things still capable of the most extraordinary, violent growth, if you are willing to do the unglamorous work of tending to them quietly in the dark, long before anyone else believes there is anything left worth saving. They thought they could rip my entire life away from me with a single piece of paper signed while my mind was still fogged with medication. They stole the formula, gutted the house, demolished the greenhouse, and they threw what remained of me onto what they clearly assumed was society's scrap heap, expecting nothing more to ever grow from it again. But they forgot the one brutal thing every farmer eventually learns, whether from a textbook or from 40 years of failure, and small, stubborn, savage victories fought out in the dirt. You can hack down the branches. You can even saw straight through the trunk itself. But if the roots remain alive somewhere beneath the surface, unseen and unaccounted for, Then when spring finally comes again, something will tear its way up from that soil, whether anyone ever gave it permission to or not. Land can die. I did not. And neither in the end did the parts of my family that still prove themselves worth saving.